The island of Dinotopia is an island of hidden wonders. A lost miracle in the middle of the ocean where dinosaurs still live, alongside humans in a utopian society. However, this utopian society only remains so due to its separation from the outside world. And the reason for that is the series of deadly reefs and currents that surround Dinotopia, known as the Razor Reef. The Razor Reef is the barrier that separates Dinotopia from the outside world, and Gurney wrote that it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to journey to the outside world through the reef from Dinotopia. Even if you were in possession of a sea chart that would enable you to maneuver through the dangerous reefs that would chop up any vessel that came near them, the reef's ever-changing currents and wind patterns would spell disaster for anyone attempting to escape Dinotopia to the outside world. And because of this, there have been very few, if any, recorded successful attempts at maneuvering through the reef back to the outside world from Dinotopia. However, while this is the case for the book version of Dinotopia, the miniseries presents something a little bit different. While the Razor Reef is mentioned by name in the miniseries and the TV series, what's actually presented as the barrier between Dinotopia and the outside world that Carl and Frank are so desperate to return to is presented as something a little different from the books. An everlasting, potentially unnatural force of nature, known only as the Storm. Hey everyone, my name is Sam and welcome back to another video. In this video, we'll be talking about something from the Dinotopia miniseries and TV series, which, as some of you know, I've been reviewing on the channel. Now, as I just said, the Razor Reef is something from Dinotopia's book lore. It's described in the books as a series of dangerous reefs surrounding the island of Dinotopia that make travel from Dinotopia back to the outside world impossible. Now, you may be thinking that a bunch of reefs may not be that much of an obstacle for ships if you had a sea chart that could allow you to find your way through. But Gurney actually wrote that the reefs themselves are not actually the only obstacle in terms of maneuvering back to the outside world. Because alongside the reefs themselves, Gurney wrote that there are actually ever-changing tide and wind patterns surrounding the island that form a pretty effective barrier. A combination of a lack of knowledge of the reefs themselves and the impossibility of accurately plotting the patterns of the tides and the wind currents because they're always changing means that it is nigh impossible to cross over to the outside world from Dinotopia. However, while it is incredibly difficult and near impossible to travel to the outside world through the Razor Reef from Dinotopia, it has not been stated to be impossible. For example, at the end of the second Dinotopia book, The World Beneath, Lee Crabbe actually seems very confident at being able to escape to the outside world with the combination of Arthur Dennison's sea chart and a strutter powered by the Ruby Sunstone. And I've also apparently read that in one of the other books there was a land bridge that connected Dinotopia to the outside world, but that's not something I have extensive knowledge on. In short, I don't actually have enough knowledge of the books to accurately discuss whether or not it is impossible to get out of Dinotopia or not. Luckily, the book version is not actually what we're going to be talking about today, because the version of the Razor Reef that is presented in the miniseries and the subsequent TV series is notably different from the version from the books. Because while the Razor Reef still seems to be a thing in the miniseries continuity, whenever we see anyone attempt to escape Dinotopia, it's never shown that the Razor Reef itself is the problem. Instead, we're presented with a seemingly ever-present natural storm. And in this video, I'm going to be going over everything that we know about this storm because I think there's actually more to it than meets the eye. The first time we see this mysterious storm is obviously in the first episode of the miniseries, where Carl, Frank, and David fly into Dinotopia in a plane. Now, obviously, straight away, this gives us a very good look at what exactly it is we're dealing with in separation from the Razor Reef itself, as obviously a reef is not going to be any issue for a flying vehicle. Now, the Scots' initial encounter with the storm makes it a little bit unclear as to the actual visibility of the storm itself from the outside. Because while it does look like the Scots are flying into some dark clouds, their dialogue suggests that the storm seemingly came out of nowhere. And although we can assume that this is probably Carl's first time flying a plane, we can also assume that he has the basic intelligence to not fly into a giant fucking storm cloud if one was on the horizon. Now, the only other explanation for this then is that the storm really did come out of nowhere. As in, it formed right in front of them, and they had no chance to divert their path. So already, it seems as though there's something weird about this storm. If it really did come out of nowhere like that, you know, storms don't do that. A storm of that magnitude that surrounds an entire 200-mile island, you'd be able to see that from a mile off. So the idea that the storm seemingly came out of nowhere like that does bring up a lot of questions. Now, once they actually enter the storm itself, it becomes very difficult for them to control their plane. Now, this isn't really anything unusual, because you would definitely expect that a tiny little plane like the one the Scots are flying would have difficulty maneuvering within the high-intensity winds of a storm like this. So that's not really anything unnatural, that's just, you know, physics. However, it's what happens right before the three of them crash land into the ocean that I want to talk about. Before the plane starts diving into the ocean, there seems to be some sort of spark that comes from the plane's controls. Now, I actually did analyze this a bit in my analysis of part 1, and again, if you haven't seen that, I would recommend checking it out. But I've been trying to figure out exactly what happened then, because in the shot immediately before, it shows the plane and then there's a lightning strike, and I've gone frame by frame on this, and it's really difficult to tell whether or not the plane is actually struck by this lightning bolt or not. There seems to be little bits of electricity on the top of the plane after the bolt has struck, but I can't tell if that's actually supposed to be the bolt striking the plane, or whether that's just meant to be residue electricity behind the plane that we can see. It's also quite difficult to tell given the camera quality and given that this was filmed in 2002. Now, obviously, if it did strike the plane, then we know what happened. The plane was struck by the bolt of lightning, and it probably fried most of the controls. But the main issue I see with this is that if the plane was struck by a bolt of lightning, I think it would have caused a lot more damage than just a tiny little spark. Plus, given that the entirety of the plane is metal, and Frank was actually holding onto the controls at the time that the bolt supposedly struck them, not only would it cause a lot more damage, it would probably electrocute the man. Carl and David may have been alright because they may not have been touching anything metal and their seats are probably leather. But even if none of them were electrocuted, I think the plane being struck by a bolt of lightning would do a whole lot more damage than what was shown here. So if that bolt of lightning didn't strike the plane, then what happened? Well, when I was younger, I used to believe that it was actually the controls, as in the joysticks of the plane on Carl's side, snapping off as he tried to regain control of the plane. But if you look closely, that's not at all what happened, so that theory's out the window too, I guess. So if it wasn't the controls snapping off, and it wasn't that the plane was struck by lightning, then what happened? Well, it could honestly be something as simple as the idea that the plane was under so much stress from the intense winds and rain that the systems malfunctioned. I think that could be a perfectly plausible theory, although I'm not an expert on planes, so I can't say whether or not that's actually a realistic thing that would happen. Or, and this is going to sound a bit outlandish, but stay with me here, the storm itself is to blame. And what specifically I'm suggesting is that the storm itself actually disabled the plane's electrical systems. Now, this is going to be something that I touch on a little bit later, so it may sound a bit outlandish and a bit weird, but just stay with me here. Now, after that, obviously, the plane crashes into the ocean, and you all know the rest. Now, I would like to briefly mention the confusing little subplot that Cyrus has in helping Carl find a way off the island. As I stated in my miniseries reviews, this is one of the most confusing plot lines of the entire miniseries. It never actually goes anywhere, and we don't really ever actually get an answer as to whether or not Cyrus actually did have a real way to get off the island. But as far as I can tell, everything to do with Cyrus is actually to do with the Razor Reef rather than the storm, because they are separate. The Razor Reef is obviously the reefs below the ocean that stop boats from escaping Dinotopia, whereas the storm is obviously the weather event. And Cyrus never actually mentions the storm, he just talks about the reef, so that could be due to a number of things. It could be that he just doesn't have any knowledge on the storm. Whether or not Cyrus actually knew a way off the island is an entirely separate video that I need to make, so I'm not really going to talk about that in this video. Now, after the first episode of the miniseries, we don't actually see the Razor Reef again until the second episode of the TV series. Now, I would like to preface this TV series part of the video by saying that I have not actually seen the final episode of the TV series, but as far as I know, it contains no information and no actual appearance by the storm or the Razor Reef, considering everything about the plot at that point is focused on the portal. Now, while the storm makes an actual appearance in episode 2, they actually do talk about it in episode 1, and what's actually quite interesting is that in episode 1, when Frank, Carl, and David are talking about the storm, they talk about it separately from the Razor Reef. And although I have a reasonably limited knowledge of the books, as far as I know, that was never a thing. They never referred to what was around Dinotopia as an actual storm. They always just referred to it as either the Razor Reef, or of course they mentioned the tides and currents and wind patterns that surrounded the island as well. It was never a storm. And not only does Frank mention the storm, the exact quote is this weird storm that circles the island. Now, while this comment does lend itself to the weird and potentially unnatural nature of the storm itself, it does also bring up another point: its lifetime. Because supposedly, this storm has been a constant thing around Dinotopia for potentially thousands, even millions of years. Because despite what the Sunstone parade in the first episode of the miniseries tells you, every single human that is on Dinotopia is descended from a castaway. And considering that the first humans were recorded as washing up on Dinotopia in 4000 BC, yeah, this storm's clearly been around a long time. Now, I've actually done some research into storms and hurricanes to try and relate that information to the storm that we're studying on Dinotopia. Now, it is possible that the storm we're studying could actually be a hurricane, but there are a few issues with that. Because if it was a hurricane, then that would mean that the area where Dinotopia is would have to be the eye of the storm, the area that's calm with all of the storm being around it. And most eyes of the storm are only around 20 to 40 miles on an average hurricane. And Dinotopia, the island itself, is around 200 miles, and even then there's probably a couple of miles between the edge of the land and the beginning of the storm. So if this was a hurricane and that was the eye of the storm, then the hurricane itself would have to be massive. An average hurricane is usually around 300 miles large, so compared that to the 20-mile eye of the storm, that's about a ratio of 15 to 1 of hurricane size to eye of the storm size. So that would mean in order for the Dinotopia storm to be a hurricane with a 200-mile plus eye of the storm, it would need to be a storm that was 3,000 miles big. Now, to put into perspective how big 3,000 miles is, that is the width of the United States of America. So somehow, I don't think there's been a 3,000-mile hurricane in the middle of the ocean for several thousand years, and no one has noticed. Not to mention that that would mean that after crashing into the ocean, Carl and David would have had to swim 1,500 miles. So yeah, I don't think that this is right. So for that reason, I think it's just not possible for it to be a hurricane, because hurricanes always have that ratio of size or something close to it. The ratio of eye of the storm to actual hurricane size is never the same. Plus, if anything, it's actually inverted in that the length of storm seems to be less than the eye of the storm, because the eye of the storm is the bit where Dinotopia is, and that's around 200 square miles. The storm is a lot less than that, because the Scots definitely did not fly or swim 200 miles to get through the storm to Dinotopia. That's not possible. That didn't happen. It wasn't that far. Obviously, regular thunderstorms are usually just a big chunk of storm that moves. A hurricane is a storm that has an eye in the middle. But either way, they both move. And the fact that it has remained in the exact same spot for several thousand years is very weird. I think the main takeaway from this quote that Frank says about the storm circling the island is that in thousands of years, the storm has not moved. And storms move. Now, during my research, I did actually find something kind of interesting in that over a lake in Venezuela, there's actually what many people refer to as an everlasting storm. It's known as the Catatumbo lightning, and basically it's just this storm over this specific lake in Venezuela that basically is continuous, because there's like perfect conditions for the storm to form, like all the time. And might I add that the storm itself is stated as being around the lake, and the lake itself is actually 5,000 square miles across. So that's pretty fucking big. So an everlasting storm isn't necessarily something unnatural or potentially magical, because apparently we actually have that in Venezuela. And you could argue that because Dinotopia probably has quite an isolated climate in comparison to the rest of the world, the interaction between that climate and the climate of the outside world creates this storm in the middle. But again, the idea that this is not just a chunk of storm, but it is a perfect ring around the outside of Dinotopia that is, number one, never moved, and number two, never faltered, that, again, is still really weird. Now, moving on from that quote and going on to episode 2, we actually see the storm reappear in full for the first time since episode 1 of the miniseries. And to be honest, I don't think there's a lot we can really gather from this encounter with the storm, because basically Frank, Marion, and Carl just go out there in a tiny little boat that would have no chance of crossing the storm, even if it was natural. And to be honest, it just gets to the point eventually when the storm is just so severe that it basically just throws all of them out of the boat. That's really all it is. If obviously they had sailed into the storm in a better boat that probably could have dealt with the conditions a bit better, then maybe we would have seen a little bit more, but alas, that's what happened. Now, the final appearance of the storm, to my knowledge at least, is in episode 9, Contact, and this is where things start to get quite interesting. Now, I'd actually like to go on record and say that this is actually my favorite episode of the entire TV series, and definitely not without reason. And that's basically completely focused on the involvement of the storm within this episode. If you haven't seen the episode, basically, Carl finds a radio in a shipwreck and makes contact with some survivors that are in a life raft outside the storm that are drifting towards it, and thus Dinotopia. And he manages to radio out to a Navy battleship on the outside to come and rescue the survivors before they go into the storm. And they manage to do so right before they get into the storm properly. Now, up until this point, everything about the storm could be chopped up to something natural. Everything that we have seen thus far about the storm could potentially have a natural explanation. However, in this episode, there is one single quote which actually suggests to me that the writers themselves were actually trying to push the idea that this was not a natural storm. As Gracie and her family drift closer to the storm, she describes it as being like an electrical storm, but it's got these weird colors to it. Now, again, I actually did some research to try and figure out if there was any natural explanation to this, and it turns out that storms and storm clouds changing colors actually has to do with tornadoes. And I think we can safely say that there isn't a tornado or tornadoes lurking within the Razor Reef storm. And stepping back from trying to explain this naturally for a second, why would the writers actually have her say this if they didn't want to push that there may be something really weird about this storm? Now, obviously, the actual storm itself was never given any explanation as to, you know, why it stays in one place, why it circles the island, and those weird colors. None of that was ever explained. We don't really even get a conversation on the storm itself. It's always the Razor Reef. Because it seems as though in this continuity, or at least in the TV series section of this continuity, the writers, whenever we hear about the storm, and it's not very often, whenever we hear about it, the writers are always describing it in a way that seems like it's trying to make us realize that there's something not right about this storm. Like, there's something that's not natural about it. And for this reason, my personal theory on the storm itself is that it is a magical barrier put in place to separate Dinotopia from the outside world. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking that it's a pretty big leap from saying, oh, it's a weird storm that circles the island and has got a few weird rainbow colors to it, to saying that it's a magical barrier, but there is actually some evidence that may support this. And for this, I'm actually going to be referencing the animated film Dinotopia Quest for the Ruby Sunstone. Now, Quest for the Ruby Sunstone basically tries to combine the miniseries stuff with the book stuff, because the miniseries and the book continuity are very different. For example, Waterfall City, when we actually see it, is the book counterpart, not the miniseries counterpart, and the carnivores are not just mindless animals. Not to mention that the Sunstones seemingly don't have the power to repel carnivores in Quest for the Ruby Sunstone either, like they do in the miniseries. But in Quest for the Ruby Sunstone, there is a particular quote that surpasses everything else we have discussed in this video. Now, before I actually cover what these quotes actually are, some of you may be thinking, okay, well, this is all well and good, but why are you referencing a completely separate continuity film when we're supposed to be talking about the miniseries and the TV series? Well, the reason that I'm citing Quest for the Ruby Sunstone is because 26, Carl's Saurian partner from the miniseries continuity, is the main character of Quest for the Ruby Sunstone. Despite the fact that the miniseries and Quest for the Ruby Sunstone continuities are very clearly separate, there is a canon character from the miniseries continuity that appears in Quest for the Ruby Sunstone, and for that reason, you know, I'm citing Quest for the Ruby Sunstone. I'm not saying that the two of them take place in the same continuity, because frankly, I don't think they do, but the fact that 26, who is exclusively a character from the miniseries, she wasn't something that was adapted from the books, or at least not to my knowledge. She was a character made up specifically for the miniseries, and the fact that she's in Quest for the Ruby Sunstone really brings up some weird questions about the canonicity of Quest for the Ruby Sunstone in comparison to the miniseries. But that's the reason that I'm talking about Quest for the Ruby Sunstone, because 26 appears in it. But basically, 26 says that Sunstones provide light and energy to Dinotopia, and then an elderly dinosaur called Albagon actually says something really interesting. He says that the Sunstones form a protective shield around Dinotopia, and 26 chimes in saying that that is what keeps Dinotopia hidden. Albagon goes on to state that if the Sunstones go out, they would be discovered by the outside world, and therefore their way of life would never be the same. Now, what I find really interesting about that specific bit of information is that while Ruby Sunstone takes its cues mostly from the books, that in particular is completely alien to anything else Dinotopia related. As far as I know, not once have the Sunstones been linked to protecting Dinotopia from the outside world. And if we were to link that back to the miniseries continuity, that would mean that the Sunstones are the cause of the storm. So it could genuinely be that the Sunstones created the storm in order to shield Dinotopia from the rest of the world. And if that really is the case, I'd actually like to discuss something else. Because Albagon says that if the Sunstones go out, then they would be discovered by the outside world. And that implies that if the Sunstones were to go out, then the protective barrier around Dinotopia would obviously disappear. Well, if you remember, the Sunstones going out was literally the entire focus of the miniseries. That was the main plotline. And by episode 3, literally every Sunstone that is within an outpost on the island has gone dark. So that begs the question, at the point in episode 3 where all of the Sunstones on the island had gone dark, did the storm disappear? Well, I'm actually going to say no. And the reason I'm going to say no is because while all the Sunstones in the outpost that protected Dinotopia from the carnivores went out in episode 3, not all of the Sunstones on the island went dark. Because of course, the Sunstone cave in the world beneath that Carl, David and Cyrus went to get more Sunstones from was very much still lit. And that is probably a bigger supply of Sunstones than probably all of the other Sunstones on Dinotopia put together. So no, due to the fact that there were still plenty of Sunstones that were still alive and well on Dinotopia, I'm going to say that no, the storm did not disappear during the events of episode 3. Obviously, episode 3 wasn't at all focused on the storm, so we didn't see it, but I'm going to say that I don't think it would have disappeared during the events of episode 3. And I would also like to mention the events of episode 1 and 2 of the TV series as well, because the whole plotline of those two episodes is that the Pendant of Zuma is overriding the Sunstones, meaning that they can't protect the inhabitants of Dinotopia from the carnivores. Now, you could argue that during the events of those episodes, the Sunstones were technically inactive. But I personally disagree with that notion, mainly for two reasons. One, during those episodes, it's not really that the Sunstones are inactive per se, it's just that one area of their magic is being overridden. As obviously we know that Sunstones do multiple things. They provide light, energy, they protect Dinotopia from the carnivores, and if Ruby Sunstone is anything to go by, they actually do form the storm as well. And obviously the Pendant of Zuma, which controls the T-Rexes, is seemingly only overriding one aspect of the Sunstone's magical powers. For example, during the events of those two episodes, whilst the Pendant of Zuma is active, the Sunstones themselves do appear to still be active, so they're still providing light and possibly energy as well. So it does appear like the Pendant of Zuma was only overriding the ability the Sunstones have to repel the carnivores and nothing else. And the second reason obviously lends itself to the first, in that we actually see the storm active in the second episode, so it's clear that the Pendant of Zuma didn't override that part of the Sunstones. So to sum it up, my final conclusion on the storm from the miniseries continuity, and you have to remember, it is specifically the miniseries continuity we're talking about here. None of this is canon to the books. But within the miniseries continuity itself, I believe that the storm that surrounds the island is a magical barrier that is generated by the power of the Sunstones. And I'd actually like to end this video on a bit of an interesting topic, because Sunstones themselves in the miniseries are something that require their own separate video, but it's never been explained why the Sunstones died in the first place. Now, I've come up with two possible explanations for this. The first is that Sunstones, like every other power source, naturally have a lifetime. They have energy, but eventually that energy will just run out, and that's what happened in episode 3. Or, and again, stay with me here, the failing of the Sunstones was a prophesized event that was always destined to happen at that specific point in time. And I won't go too much into this theory because it's definitely something that I'd want to discuss in another video. But basically, I'm theorizing that the Sunstones dying around the time that Carl, David and Frank came to Dinotopia was not actually a coincidence, and that the Sunstones dying was actually a way of Dinotopia moving forward into a new age. Because we know that Carl, David and Frank, as outsiders, have brought many new things to Dinotopia, and they've changed it in more ways than one. After the events of the miniseries, Dinotopia becomes a lot less focused on sacrificing progress for tradition, and that's because of David and Carl. So could it be that the Sunstones did actually fail in order to bring Dinotopia into a new age? Not to mention the fact that the 11th code that they find in the world beneath, Find the Light, does actually suggest that the ancient dinosaurs that made the ancient codes were aware that the Sunstones would eventually fade away. Now, because of this, does that mean that eventually all of the Sunstones on Dinotopia will fade away, and that will be a sign that it is time for Dinotopia to merge with the outside world. Because obviously if the Sunstones go out, then presumably the storm around the island will fade away as well. And when that happens, inevitably Dinotopia and the outside world are bound to finally collide. But that's a theory for another video. I hope you all enjoyed this video delving into the mysteries of the mysterious storm from the Dinotopia miniseries. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff from this idiot right here. And if you're a Dinotopia fan, go and join the Dinotopia unofficial Discord down in the description down below. And if you want to stay up to date with everything that I'm doing Dinotopia and otherwise, then go and join the casual Discord, which will alert you whenever I upload a video, go live, and give you guys teasers on future projects. So thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and I will see you on another video very, very soon. Goodbye, everyone.